Who doesn't know Bruce Van Wyk in this room? There are many people who are more qualified than I to introduce Bruce. I met Bruce 40 years ago. I was just a kid. Just joined the University of Nairobi. Had come to Christ at Sitam Valley Road. Dennis Tongwe had hoped to lead me to Christ, but somebody else did. And so as a freshman on campus, joining the Navigator ministry and meeting Bruce and Marg and other missionaries. One of the things that strikes me about Bruce at that very time was a country leader taking an interest in students, in first-year students. There was no barrier between the highest leader in the organization and the smallest person in the organization. The newest believer is the smallest person. Bruce and Marg have been married 57 years. They have 3 girls, as many of you know, 9 grandsons, 1 granddaughter, 1 great-grandson. Bruce came to Kenya after serving in Norway for 7 years. They came in 1986. He was 36 years old then and came and served for 9 years before handing the work over to Mutua Mahaini. They've been back in the States, serving and ministering in various capacities. But as we're interacting more recently, the impressive thing to me is that 4 years ago, well in their 70s, they took on an assignment to travel back to Africa to encourage leaders in the southern part of Africa. Not just short-term trips. They make 2 trips a year and stay for 2 months at each trip. So when you're asking for a man to speak on the subject of ministering into your old age, we couldn't get a better man than Bruce Van Wyk. Bruce, can I pray for you? I'm going to read from Psalm 92, 12 to 14, and then pray. The righteous will flourish like a palm tree. They'll grow like a cedar of Lebanon, planted in the house of the Lord. They'll flourish in the courts of our God. They will still bear fruit in old age. They will stay fresh and green, proclaiming, the Lord is upright. He is my rock. There is no wickedness in him. Lord, as Bruce leads us in the plenary messages during this time together, would you help us to proclaim, like the righteous that's written about in the scriptures, the Lord is upright, he is my rock, and there is no wickedness in him. Bless him, use him, help him. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Stanley.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. This morning, as I was waking up, which was about 3 a.m., I think it was, when I woke up, the verse that came to my mind was Psalm 126, verse 1, and it talks about when the people of Israel were returning from exile in Egypt, or in Babylon, it says, we were like those who dream. Remember that? That's how Marg and I are feeling these days. In fact, they're probably going to need a box of Kleenex up here if somebody's got... It's very, very emotional for us to come back. We've been back, of course, many times since 1986, December, when we left Kenya. But only the Lord knew. And what has happened these past almost 40 years. Now, there's my daughter, Irene, is taking care of her old father. Thank you, Irene. And, of course, we've had the joy of having our sister Esther and Mutua and Stephanie living almost next door to us in Colorado Springs for the last many years. And many of you have been in their home and been in our home. So we are like those that dream. And all the glory goes to God. He's the one that made it happen, isn't he? And what a privilege we've had, each one of us, just have a little part in building his kingdom. Not our own kingdom, but his kingdom. Now, I do have to confess that I too, like Mughal Karanja, have the what I call the powerful wife syndrome. And I think several. As I look around, Dennis, and where's, it seems like these Kenyan women they're powerful women. But I too have that syndrome, and one of the friends approached Marg mentioned last night that she met the Navigators in 1948, and so then this person said, "Well, how old were you?" And in 1948, she was 10 years old. And so her brother, who was 10 years older than her, and some of you have met him, Bob Glockner. Actually, Bob and Merle Glockner came here, and they visited Moto training program in Mombasa about, what was that, 72? 82. So anyway, so I met Marg in 1959 at this small Bible college in northern Minnesota. Of course, that was 60 years ago this year. And so she was really technically the first Navigator I met. So then I asked her if she would disciple me. And, she agreed that would probably be. Oh, man. Well, I was looking for the most beautiful girl on campus. That was my habit, unfortunately, those days. But, and there I met Marg. I could still remember she was getting the mail from her mailbox there in the hallway of the admin building at Oak Hills Bible College, 1959. Now, little did either one of us realize, what God had in store. But he did draw our hearts together, and we united in marriage in 1962. Didn't have a clue what God wanted us to do, but we knew we wanted to follow him, and we knew we wanted to serve him. That we were both committed to do. And so later then moved out to East Texas to attend another Christian college. And as I mentioned last night, that's where I met Denny Repko, who was the first real navigator. Well, no, I shouldn't say my wife's not a real navigator. But that's when our journey with the Navigators began. And of course, Denny Repko, some of you know him. He's been involved in the church discipleship ministries for many years. He was partially discipled by Marg's brother, Bob Glockner. So Bob Glockner was a real networker, and he loved to connect people. And so when we moved to Longview, Texas, he gave Denny the message to look us up. And so we stand here today, really as a result of that initial time. So God, as Stanley mentioned, the Lord has blessed our union. When we came here in 77, we had the three girls. Sherry was 13, Kristen was 8, and Sonia was 6. And now those three girls are married and have given us 10 grandchildren. And could I have a glass of water up here for someone, please? So, in fact, Sonia came back here and lived here for 3 years. Some of you may remember, and they worked with an organization called Young Life out at the International School of Kenya. So, and then Sherry and Mark Stone, they live in Little Rock, Arkansas. Kristen and Paul Stanley live in Denver, and they have our only granddaughter, Catherine. And then Sonia and Marshall live out in New Jersey, and they have 3 boys. So that's our crew. And then, of course, thank you very much. As was mentioned, last November 22, we got our first great-grandson. So Sherry's oldest son, Joshua, married Nicole, and they blessed us with our first great-grandson. So that, as you can appreciate, that was a big celebration in our lives and journey. And we think, what have we done to receive the blessing? All 10 of our grandchildren have received Christ as their Savior. They're all a progress underway. They're all working, you know how it is with kids, but they all have made a profession of Christ as their Savior. And so we are thankful. We're thankful. And the kids, they too with us, look back on those years in Kenya. And that's where the kids grew up here. And that's why we have this very warm attachment and relational connection. Someone asked me the other day, they said, why do you keep coming back to Kenya? And I said, because of you. Because of you. That's why we keep coming back. We have been so blessed. We have been so honored. We have been so appreciated by you, dear friends, in ways that are just beyond description. I think it's a unique, we have visited a lot of other countries in Africa, but you have something unique here in the way I think Africans generally do honor their elders. You're good at that, compared to our American society. But we have been blessed beyond our wildest dreams because of what you, dear friends, have done in deepening and expanding and growing this ministry. And by God's grace, we want to continue being a part of it as He would give us enablement. This morning I want to talk a bit about finishing well. And then on Sunday morning, we're going to talk about serving in your senior years. And I'm going to be quoting my friend Dennis Tangoy over here, who many years ago said, it's not retiring, it's refiring. Remember that, Dennis? So I'm going to be quoting him this weekend. Not retiring, but refiring. I can't roll that R quite like you do, Dennis, but and so we're going to take a look at Caleb. I figured Caleb was probably the best person we could study and look at for the idea of finishing well, because in in Joshua chapter 14, verses 10, 11, it says that 45 years after God gave the promise to Moses, Caleb, who was one of the 12 spies that went into the promised land, it says there that he was 85 years old. Is anybody here 85? Mark and I are getting closer. We're working that direction, but we still have a few years to go. But Caleb was 85 years old, and then he made that statement in Joshua 14, Lord, give me that mountain. So we're kind of trying to follow in the footsteps of Caleb. We're going to look at a couple of unique characteristics of his life, and then we're going to look at some of the hindrances that keep us from going on as we grow older. And then lastly, I'm going to look at some biblical convictions that undergird our faith as we move not only now, but into our senior years, that keep us focused on God's glory and God's kingdom. But just a few thoughts on Caleb. It says in Numbers 14:24, my servant Caleb has a different attitude than others have. He has remained loyal to me, so I will bring him into the land he explored. His descendants will possess their full share of that land. So there's 5 quick observations here we'll make about Caleb. First of all, it says Caleb was a servant. He was the Lord's servant. And, Jesus himself said he did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. I think that's Mark 10:45. Caleb was described as a servant, as a Lord's servant. Someone told me one time, you can tell if you're a servant or not when someone treats you like a servant and you see how you respond when they do that to you. That's been embarrassing for me at times when I've been treated like a servant, but I didn't respond like a servant. That's how we can often tell. But Caleb was a servant. That was the first thing. Then it says Caleb had a different spirit. And of course, we know that when 12 spies went into the promised land and they saw the giants, well, 10 of them saw the giants, but 12, Joshua and Caleb, they saw the land the Lord had promised. And you wonder what made the difference. It's interesting, isn't it, how all 12 people did the same. They were together. They all went in and saw the same giants. They all saw the same obstacles. But 2 of the guys saw possibilities rather than problems. And Caleb was one of those people. He had a different spirit. He saw the potential rather than the problem. He saw the possibilities rather than the problem. Then the third thing about Caleb's life here, it says Caleb followed the Lord wholeheartedly. And he was obedient to all that God required of him. John 14:21, one of the verses that was in the old TMS. He who has my commandments and keeps them, he is the one who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and will show myself to him. Sometimes we say, well, I know, Lord, what you want me to do, but I don't seem to have the strength or the energy to do it. And then Paul says in Philippians 2:13 that he will not only help us to do what we need to do, but he will even make us willing if we desire to be made willing, that is. And so that was Caleb. He followed the Lord wholeheartedly. And it's interesting, isn't it, that was not just in the beginning of his life, but at the end. And we're going to be talking about more of that this weekend, because I think most of us would acknowledge that as you grow and become older and older, the lack of energy, the lack of strength, it just takes a little bit more effort, doesn't it, to get things done. And but Caleb, even in his latter years, he followed the Lord wholeheartedly. Then the fourth thing about Caleb says that he entered the promised land. Isaiah 1:19 says, if you be willing and obedient, there's that obedience thing again, you will eat the good of the land. If you're willing and obedient, you will eat the good of the land. Now, I know there's different thoughts about, is the promised land in the Old Testament, is that a picture of heaven, or is that a picture of the victorious Christian life? And, there may be applications both ways. But I've always believed that when they came out of Egypt, the people of Israel, remember when they sprinkled the blood over the doorpost, and it says, when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And today we're celebrating the crucifixion of our Lord Jesus. This was a few thousand years before Jesus was even crucified. But they still used the blood as a means of the forgiveness of sins. And so Caleb entered that land, and the promised land, I think, is a picture of the victorious Christian life. The victorious Christian life. Because those people who died in the wilderness, they didn't make it into the promised land, but they had come out of Israel because they sprinkled that blood over their doorpost and were saved. Salvation happened when the people left Egypt. The fifth thing we see about Caleb here is that it says his descendants will possess their full share of that land. And in Joshua, let's see here, 1:6, the promise about Let me just look this up quickly. I should know that from memory. Probably most of you can quote that one, but Joshua 1:6, be strong and courageous, for you are the one who will lead these people to possess all the land I swore to their ancestors I will give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the instructions Moses gave you. Do not deviate from them, turning either to the right or the left. So Caleb's descendants entered, they were able to enter the promised land. And that sort of touches on the idea, doesn't it, of spiritual generations we talk about in the Navigators. And of course, we heard about that this morning. And here we set a room full of people who are our descendants, spiritual descendants of someone who invested their life in you. And we sit here today. Well, that was true of Caleb. He also was, his descendants they made it into the promised land, fulfillment of Caleb's faith. I want us to focus a little bit on Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, is the hallmark of fame, and you're all familiar with it, I know. And it'd be interesting. We could rewrite the book of Hebrews, couldn't we? Hebrews 11, by faith, Mutwa, by faith, Dennis, by faith. We could go on and on and on of people right here in Kenya, right here in this ministry, who obeyed God just like these people in Hebrews chapter 11. The hallmark of fame. Now, then, as we get to the end of 11 and move into chapter 12 of Hebrews 12, the first word in chapter 12 is therefore. Therefore, and wherever you see a therefore, you have to ask, what is it therefore? And of course, it's referring back to those heroes mentioned: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, and Joseph. And Moses gets his name in there quite a bit. They refused to place their, others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. All these people earned a good reputation because of their faith, yet none of them received all that God had promised. And that generation died in the wilderness, didn't they? Because of their unbelief and their unfaithfulness. Now then, so Hebrews 12 then, that's what I want us to focus on a little bit. Starts out, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. We do this, verse 2, by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion, who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, celebrating that today, discarding its shame. Now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. Let us strip off the weight. And, of course, the unbelief and the unfaithfulness is what kept the people of Israel from entering into the promised land, wasn't it? Now, I try to give some thought, and I think we're going to have some discussion around the tables here, after I'm finished here. But I'm asking myself the question, what are some of the weights, some of the sins that are more prevalent in our 50s, 60s, and 70s? Again, we'll talk about that around the tables, but I'll list a few things that I put down here. What are some of the sins, the weights, that are more prevalent in our 50s, 60s, and 70s? The first one that I thought of was the sin of what I call complacency. Complacency. I've been there. I've done that. You know, I've paid my dues. I've been through Discipleship 101. I've led people to Christ. I've discipled people, on and on, you know. I've tried to serve the Lord my whole life. So I think it's time to kind of pull back on the throttle and eat, drink, and be merry, you know, or take life a little bit easier. I call that complacency. And I'll be honest with you, it's tougher. It is tougher at this stage of life than it was in my 30s and 40s. And I can see by looking out here that you're kind of nodding your heads, you're identifying with that. It just gets tougher, doesn't it? And I think it's Galatians 6 that says, let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. Do you feel like fainting? Do you feel like quitting, giving up? Man, I sure do. So that's something that I think is perhaps unique or specifically that takes place as we move into our senior years. I mean, I was 36 years old when we came to Kenya. When we came to Kenya in 1977, June. And our engines were revving, you know. I mean, we were ready to take it on. It's exciting, isn't it? And some of you talked about Operation Joshua, that first. Yeah, I mean, those were amazing things God did. And it was exciting, and we just like, there was no price. I mean, I remember thinking, there's no price that we're not willing to pay to serve the Lord. I mean, it's like we're in this thing 100%. But as one grows older, we get a little more cautious, a little more protective, a little more, so, and we'll talk more about that later, but then there's room for, fortunately, I mean, God understands that our strength is waning, that we can't do what we used to do, and a lot of it, health issues are a big thing that we're challenged with. So, the sin of complacency. Then, another one of the things I think that happens, I call it the sin or the weight of losing sight of the ultimate goal. Losing sight of the ultimate goal. I'd like to refer to that example in Hebrews chapter 11, 23 through 25. It says, Moses, chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt. He was looking ahead to his great reward. Now here's Moses. Moses was the secretary of, he was the prime minister, wasn't he, of Egypt. And all the wealth he had. And I remember years ago watching the movie, The Ten Commandments. And it showed Moses down in the mud, tramping straw in mud with the people of Israel so they could make bricks. You remember how Pharaoh took the straw away, made them produce more bricks, and all that. So it says that Moses chose to suffer ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of, to be that big guy at the top as Pharaoh's right-hand man. I call it perspective. Understanding how what I'm doing today relates to eternity. And again, as we grow older, the tendency is that goal that we've all been working and looking toward gets a little dimmer because the temptations as we grow older is to look after myself, put my self-interest, and so on. Another one of the challenges along the way is the sin of giving into the flesh. I mentioned Hebrews 6, Ephesians 6, where it talks about let us not be weary in well-doing. Ephesians 6 is that chapter about the warfare, the armor of the Christian. And the struggle, it says in Ephesians 6:12, is not against flesh and blood, it's not against people, but the struggle is against the principalities, the powers, the rulers of the darkness of this age. And I will have to testify to you that it is easier for me today in my late 70s to give in to the temptation of sin than it was in my 30s and 40s. Now, your experience may be different, but that's my experience. And I remember talking and thinking that I was hoping that as I grew older, we'd get past some of that stuff. But it doesn't, my experience has not been that way. And the will to resist the temptation of giving in to sin as an older person, I think it's something it's something that I have certainly lived with all my life. It doesn't get easier. Satan is a faithful enemy. The four spiritual laws says God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. And the opposite of that is that Satan loves you, Satan hates you, and he's out to destroy you. He's out to take us down. He is out to destroy us. And the more you're engaged and involved in doing the work of God's kingdom, the more you're going to experience his attack in these areas. Okay, well, another one I thought of, the story about the guy in the New Testament. He's been the farmer, he's been very, very fruitful, and he's got this big harvest. And so what are we going to do? He said, well, I'm going to tear down my barns and build greater. And so the other thing I put down here is I call it the sin of greed. The sin of greed. And I think that passage is Luke 12, 15 through 21. It's about the tearing down your barns and building greater. I think especially those that are in professional careers, and we've had this discussion with some of our friends in the U.S., businessmen ask themselves, when is enough? How big do you need to build your earthly kingdom? You're going to tear down your barn and build bigger and bigger and bigger, and assume unto yourself more and more and more wealth. Now, I don't know really the circumstances, don't need to know of the individuals in this group, but I've found, once again, the older we get, sometimes our faith is waning a bit and we don't take risks like we used to, which is somewhat natural. How much is enough? And when greed sets in, greed is a spiritual disease that corrupts your values and your heart and your loyalty and your passion for Jesus. So, when is enough enough? Whose kingdom are you building? Now, those of you who know me, and most of you in this room, know that I'm a guy, I like to have fun. Yes. I like to enjoy life. I like to enjoy the nice things of life. I remember I was joking with Mike Trenier one time, and I said, one of my goals was that the Africa leadership team meeting could be held at Mount Kenya Safari Club. Oh, that'd be kind of nice. Just once, Well, so God, he's a big and a generous God. He is. And he allows us to do things that we're not worthy of. It's true, isn't it? And I remember the quote by Nate Saint, who was one of the missionaries who was martyred in Ecuador, South America. He says, he is no fool who gives that which he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. So I'm not a narcissist, I'm not one who believes that each time we want to have fun, God reaches down and wraps us on the knuckles, No. And many of you here, you've experienced the goodness and the lavishness with which God pours out onto our lives. I mean, it's just incredible, isn't it? So it's not about receiving from the Lord that which he wants to give us, but it's when we take it to extreme and we really lose sight of who gave, where did all this come from in the first place? And we begin to take upon ourselves the glory and the credit for what's happened. So, life gets to be a struggle. It's hard, isn't it? It's hard. And I think I'm going to ask my dear wife, Stanley mentioned about 4 years ago, we were asked if we would consider helping do what we call a long-sider ministry down in the southern part of Africa. So we would base ourselves in Johannesburg 2 months out of the year and then travel into the countries of southern Africa, like where David was. Botswana was one of them, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, and so on. We were in our 70s when we got this request. And, we think, really? But anyway, God spoke to my dear wife, and so I want Marg to come and tell her story of how she experienced that and what she went through in that. The Queen Mother.
Okay, when we were asked to take on that assignment, my first thought was, at our age, really, Lord? Are you sure? And so I knew that when Bruce heard it, he was like, I'm ready. He was ready to go. But I was sort of hesitating. I just didn't feel for sure that this is God's plan for us. So but Bruce had assured me, he said, we're not going to do this unless we're both in agreement. And he wasn't pushing me. He was giving me time to process, to pray about it and spend time with the Lord. And so as I was meditating a lot in the book of Colossians those days, I came across Colossians 4:17, and it says, and say to Archippus, be sure to carry out the ministry the Lord gave you. And so I'm thinking, what is the ministry the Lord has given us this last 40 years? It's always been involved on the African continent. So I didn't tell Bruce right away, but I was marinating on this verse. It was like the Lord was saying, and say to Marg and Bruce, be sure to carry out the ministry the Lord gave you. And so I had my giants in the land, because I'm thinking, how are we going to afford this? All this travel in the continent, and how are we going to live? Where are we going to live? What's all the what ifs of that decision. And so anyway, about 2 weeks praying through this passage of Scripture and asking God what he wanted us to do, I felt my heart was at peace, and I felt totally 100% sure that God was calling us to do this. And I told Bruce, and of course he was very happy about it. We still didn't know how it was going to work out as far as the financial part of it. But about 2 weeks or so after that, there was a lady that called us. She was in her 90s, and she said she wanted to put us in her will. So she's still living, so we wouldn't have had the will then, the money for it then. But then when Bruce was talking to her, he said, what would really help us right now is because we are doing this traveling, if the money could be available now, it could really meet the need that we have for our traveling to Africa. So she changed her plan, and so she's been supporting our travel in Africa. So that was my one giant. that was, that God resolved, and so it funded pretty much our traveling to Africa the last 4 years. So we were very thankful. We found a place to stay. We found transportation to use. About one day we got there, it was all settled. I mean, I just couldn't believe every boom, 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 boom. It just worked out so well. And so that's my story of how I got there and how we got there together.
Very good. Thank you. And I think it's Saturday afternoon, we're going to talk about growing gracefully together. And we'll talk more about marriage and about partnering, husband and wife partnering together. And I remember Mark and I talking back then, we've decided at this stage of our lives that whatever we do, we're going to do together. Now, even when we were living here in Kenya, I had to travel a lot, and our famous trip with Nick to the States, I was gone 6 weeks away from Marg and the girls. So we've done that. But at this stage of our lives, we believe God wants whatever we do, we're going to do together. And I had assured her that this assignment in Southern Africa that we would do it together. And if she didn't have peace about it, we wouldn't do it. So anyway, it's been, that's another kind of whole subject, and we want to kind of talk more about that on Saturday afternoon. The importance of partnering together as husband and wife. I mean, I could never, ever, ever do what I'm doing without Marg supporting and being with me. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for the labor. Well, I've written down here 6 truths that have motivated me to not give up and to finish well. And one thing that has been very, very, I would say, foundationally motivational for us, I intentionally try to start every day by asking 2 questions. And these questions happened when the Apostle Paul met Christ on the road to Damascus. And he asked 2 questions. He said, "Who are you, Lord?" And secondly, "What do you want me to do?" The Lordship of Christ. I made a fundamental, clear, conscious choice in March of 1959, my senior year in high school. I was a Christian, but I was a Christian that had 1 foot in the world and 1 foot in my church. I was a hypocrite with a capital H. And I was experiencing the conflict of that in my heart. And the verse God used was Matthew 6:24. No man can serve 2 masters. That's what I was doing. I was trying to serve God and trying to serve money or myself. And so I would say that that's been one of the foundational truths upon which my life was built and which I try to practice every day. Who are you, Lord? And what do you want me to do? And even like that experience that Marg just shared. Who are you, Lord? Do you want us to move to South Africa? Spend 4 months a year down there traveling? Do you want us to do that? And of course we waited on him, and we all need to know what God's will is. We need to make sure we know it's his will and not just our own desire or someone else. Another area that I would say that's been helpful to us, and we'll talk a bit more about this Saturday, is to develop a network of meaningful friendships. I'm talking now about truths that enable us to finish well. That's kind of the overall. One of the things I've learned is that one of Satan's primary strategies, is to isolate us and get us to live a life of secrecy. Hiddenness is another word for it. To live a hidden life. And I think, men, we struggle with this more than women do. And in Africa, I think it's even maybe more so, although it's similar as it is in the U.S. We seem to have the issue that we have the male ego we have to protect, and if we are vulnerable as a man, it means we're weak, right? If you share your struggles, you're weak. You're supposed to be the big, powerful Bwana Mkubwa, can do it all. And so what I've observed is that women connect a lot faster spiritually and emotionally than men do. Now, why is that? I think part of it is just our role in society. We're supposed to be the head of the home. We're supposed to be, the Bwana Mkubwa, the big person. And so one of the things that, Proverbs 27:17 says, iron sharpens iron, so the countenance of one man sharpens another man. And that would be also true for women. Ecclesiastes 4:9-10, you know it. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. So in my life, and we'll talk more about this on Saturday, we've got a group of 7 couples that we meet with in Colorado Springs called the Covenant Group. You guys have something similar. We meet once a month, and we meet to pray together, to encourage each other. And the verse that says, you weep with those that weep, and you rejoice with those that rejoice. Now, these 7 couples we meet with, they're all Navigator staff. They're all in their late 70s and 80s. One lady is 85. And we spend quite a bit of time talking about children and grandchildren. And I don't need to go into the detail, but there are a lot of challenges. Divorced children, grandkids on drugs, and so on and so on. Life is not always pretty. Life can get messy. And you know what I'm talking about. So that's one of the things that has helped us to finish well. Do not live a life alone. Going to church, that's good, but I'm not talking about going to church. I'm talking about having a small group of people with whom you are connected, that you can share your victories and your defeats, and especially for men. Now, I have one person that I have a relationship with. His name is Larry Leitner. Some of you know him. Larry and I, he lives in North Dakota. We live in Colorado, so we only see each other about 3 times a year. We have no secrets between us. I tell him everything. He tells me everything. And we tell each other things we don't even tell our wives. The point I'm talking about is maintaining a network of meaningful relationships. That's kind of the overall theme. And especially, I'm kind of putting pressure on you men to be vulnerable and open with each other. Now, you don't do that with lots of people. You do that with maybe 1 or 2, but 1 particularly, that you just covenant together. And then if someone has that kind of trust in you, that they share their heart with you, covenant before God. You do not go around and blabbing that to anybody, not even your own wife. That'll destroy, and it has destroyed, many a friendship, because people have shared their struggles, and then later they hear about people talking about it. I mean, it's destructive. Okay, I'll close with this. Well, my 6th point was never stop living by faith. That's another topic, but we found this note about Billy. Billy Graham died last year, and I think it was in February. We watched his whole funeral on the television. Some of you maybe saw it. You remember the testimony of Billy's daughter? His daughter has been through 2 or 3, I think 2 divorces. Yeah. And she talked about driving home to Billy. I get tearful just thinking about this. But she was driving home to see to meet her dad, and she had gone through a second divorce, and she was really kind of fearing meeting her dad, especially when it was Billy Graham. But she pulled the car into the yard, and you probably saw it when she told a beautiful story. But he said, he opened her arms like that, and he said, "Welcome home." That's what he said to his daughter. We'd been divorced 2 times. It was so powerful. Divorce is not the unpardonable sin. God still has hope for people who've been through divorces. And I'm going to just read you, and we'll close with this. Billy Graham, how would you like to be, somebody asked Billy, how would you like to be remembered? He says, "I hope I will be remembered as someone who is faithful to God, faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ, and to the calling God gave me, not only as an evangelist, but also as a husband, a father, and a friend." And Billy Graham would often talk about, he was such a humble person. And the regrets he had to do with family. You know, he said, if I had to do my life over again, I'd probably spend more time with my family. But then he said this, I'm sure I have failed in many ways, but I take comfort in Christ's promise of forgiveness. And I take comfort in God's ability to take even our most imperfect efforts and use them for his glory. Now, there's Billy Graham talking about his failures. My goodness. By the time you read this, Billy says, I will be in heaven. And as I write this, I look forward with great anticipation to the day when I will be in God's presence forever. So there's a man who lived his life well. I think Billy was 99 years old. He died in February. He would have been 100 in November. So he died in his 100th year. Well, let's turn it back to Mugo, and we're going to have a lot of fun this weekend, okay?